blah, blah, blah.
Perfect. Awesome, Andy. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you can't see me, but I'm right here.
Yeah, well, I can see your hand. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, really excited to be here all. I will flag that I'm a little bit under the weather, a little bit hoarse, so like there might be times when my voice like breaks a little bit, but super excited to talk. Yeah, I love talking about this stuff in general, and also like we'll be curious about the discussion on what you're all doing with AI and thinking about. So yeah, looking forward.
Awesome. Yeah. So do you think you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself and kind of what led you to start researching environmental impact of AI?
Yeah. So there's a lot to say. I got pretty fired up about climate change back in college. It was a double major in physics and philosophy, and in both of those was thinking a lot about like the ethics of climate change and things like that. Um, I was coming from this background perspective for a while, way before I started writing about this. That one, like, I'm very skeptical of very small cuts in your like day-to-day life to help with your personal emissions. There are a lot of different reasons for this. Like most people who focus on like what interventions actually help you reduce your total carbon emissions, which really matters. Most of those involve like single, very large cuts. There are a lot of different reasons for this. There's something called the rebound effect, which I can talk about later. And separately, I was also very skeptical of like relative comparisons between very small parts of our like daily emissions. So just as one example that I would used to use a lot in college, um, the energy use of say like a digital clock is like 1 million times as much as the energy of an analog watch that you might wear. But that doesn't really tell you anything about which one of those is like really bad for the environment because they're both so small in an absolute sense that they both round to zero. So it's technically true that like a digital clock is 1 million times as bad for the environment as an analog watch because they're so small. Like they both round to zero in the grand scheme of things. And so I was kind of primed to be somewhat skeptical of a lot of like common talking points about AI in the environment. And I was starting to see them come up a lot more around January of last year. I was just going to a lot of parties and I would like offhandedly mention like, oh, I use ChatGPT to, look at this or that. And I would have a lot of people be like, oh, you use ChatGPT? That's terrible for the environment. It's 10 times as much as a Google search. And I remember at the time, like, I'd been following AI for a while, and I'd also been a physics teacher for 7 years. So I just knew a lot about how these like energy quantities looked and how they compared to each other. And my first reaction to this was always like, well, 10 Google searches still isn't very much energy. Like if I had told you that I had done like 500 Google searches today, would your first reaction be, oh, this guy doesn't care about the environment? He's like a sicko. Like, that's crazy. Like, have you ever heard a climate scientist mention, like, oh, maybe you should cut your Google searches? Like, that would sound very strange to me. So, like, I, like when I was hearing this, like alarm bells were going off, and I was worried that this was kind of similar to the like the watch and the digital clock example, where like a large multiple of an incredibly small number can still be so small that it doesn't add very much to our everyday emissions. So I had basically like compiled a lot of my own research on this. Like I'm not really relying on any of my own estimates here. I'm relying on like external, like professional estimates of like how much the median chatbot prompt uses. And I was noticing that in a lot of reporting on this, almost all reporting would compare it to these other incredibly tiny things that we do. It would be like, yeah, like a chatbot is like 10 times as much as a Google search, or it's like other tiny things like that. And when instead I started comparing it in the way that I think interventions for the climate should be compared, which is to our like absolute levels of emissions, there I was finding just a wildly different story. Like best I can tell is that you would probably have to send somewhere on the order of like 200 chatbot prompts per day to increase your daily emissions by about 1%. And that basically makes it seem like it's almost impossible to actually significantly raise your emissions like just using ChatGPT. And obviously there are a lot of other AI tools that I can talk about separately. But I'd written that up in a blog post because I was finding that like this talking point wasn't always a hit at parties. I would start to say this and people would be like, oh, like you're a shill for big AI, like somebody tricked you. And I would be like, no, I swear, I've been thinking about this for a while. And I basically wanted a single place to have all my arguments in one place. So I'd written a blog post in January of last year called Using ChatGPT Isn't Bad for the Environment. And I didn't really expect it to go anywhere because I was like, oh, I just wrote a blog post about how a computer program doesn't emit as much as a car, and I'm like, that doesn't sound super useful to most people. But it actually blew up pretty fast, like within a week. Like there's a New York Times tech podcast that some of you might listen to, Hard Fork, and the hosts were like using my blog post to like argue with an environmentalist who was talking about AI, and I was like, whoa, that's a little bit weird. Very fast. So basically since then, I started to do more digging because I was pretty unhappy with how the media was covering this. Like, I remember the first article I ever read about ChatGPT and the environment had said something like, this was written way back in 2023, back when ChatGPT was very new, and it had said like, oh, like ChatGPT as a whole is now using 2 times as much energy as a whole person. And I was like, man, like this is an incredibly popular app already. And like I'm sure Instagram also uses like a large multiple of people's worth of energy. Like this on its own doesn't really tell me anything. And I was consistently surprised at like what I thought was like the pretty bad state of how this was being discussed in public. So started doing more deep dives on this, turned into looking more into data centers as well. And yeah, ended up building a pretty big audience and like I think like changed the narrative a decent amount. I've like become one of the main people read on like the environmental impacts of AI and data centers. And I'm personally coming from a more skeptical angle than the average commentator.
Oh my gosh, that was amazing. First, I want to clap for
Thank
that.
you. Okay, I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I do have a question for the end, because it's like what I honestly sometimes struggle with is like, what do you say to people when they are like, oh my gosh, you're bought out by ChatGPT, how dare you think
Yeah,
in it?
happens more and more.
Yeah, I'll save that for the end. But my first question is, what is the actual environmental footprint of generative AI tools like Runway, 11 Labs, Luma, etc., compared to everyday activities people already do? Can you give us a relatable comparison?
Yeah, so I do want to flag, like I said before, that I'm a little bit wary of like comparisons to other things that we do, just because most people, including myself, don't actually have like a great sense of like how much any one thing that we do contributes to our daily emissions. So like as an example, if you pause for a second and just ask yourself like how many times would you have to charge your phone to equal the emissions of driving your car a mile? Like, and if you stop and think about that, like maybe it's just a few, maybe it's like a million. If you look into it, the number's actually like 50 to 100, which actually surprised me. I expected it to be more than that. But like, it's a little bit difficult making these comparisons because I could say like, oh, ChatGPT uses about this many phone charges worth of emissions. But even that doesn't actually tell us like too much because a lot of people don't know how their phone compares to like other emissions that we have. I actually have some notes on this typed down that I just need to cycle through. So basically, like, I usually like to start with any AI tool and ask, like, pausing on the like individual comparisons, just how much does it add to your overall daily total emissions? And if it's very small, like if 1,000 uses of an AI tool only added 1% to your emissions, it's actually likely to be lowering your emissions on net because like if you spent literally all day using this one tool that only emits 1% of what you usually do throughout the day, like at the end, it's actually likely that you emitted way less than if, say, like you got in your car and drove around and did something. So like there are actually instances where just hanging out and poking at AI like image generators on your computer is like the most environmentally conscious thing you could do. So like that's like there's a lot to say there. So basically, best I can tell right now is that image generation tools specifically seem to use something like 1 to 3 watt hours per prompt. And if anybody's curious, like I don't think it would be like it would take me a while to get like my sources together, but like if anybody's like skeptical of these numbers, like you can also look into them yourself, just to make sure that I'm getting them right. But best I can tell right now is that image generators use about 1 to 3 watt hours of energy per prompt. And audio generators like 11 Labs is probably like 1 to 3 watt hours of energy used per minute of audio generated. And so to put this in context, this means that to raise your personal emissions by 1% throughout the day, you would probably have to make about 400 AI images or make about 6 hours of 11 Labs audio. And again, like, I want you to think about just how long it would take you to make and analyze 400 AI images. Like, I'm personally like mildly addicted to like image generators. Like, I just think they're really cool. Like, I don't know who's played with like the ChatGPT image generator that I think just came out yesterday, but even that's pretty crazy. But like, I don't think I've ever sat around just making 400 images in one day. And if I were doing that, and like at the end of the day, I was like, wow, phew, a long day of hard work generating AI images. That was very, that was very productive. Like, if all of that only took 1% of my emissions, it's very likely that I emitted way less than if I would have done a lot of other things. This does get back into the rebound effect, which I had mentioned earlier. Like the general idea of the rebound effect in climate is that like almost everything that we do carries some environmental cost and has some emissions associated with it. And so if you cut one incredibly small thing, like if you met someone who was like, oh, for the sake of the environment, I'm not using my microwave like 10 seconds less than I would otherwise. Like I'm stopping it just a few seconds early just to make sure that I save those extra seconds of energy. Like if they did that and like ate their food a little bit early, it's very likely that they would use those extra few seconds to then go and do something else that also emits about as much as their microwave, because like almost everything else that we do involves some level of emissions. And so like if you met someone who was like, "Oh, I used to like make AI images all day, and that was, that was crazy for the environment. So now I just do normal things like, I drive my car and I like go out and do all these other things." Like, it's very likely that they've actually increased their emissions by boycotting AI in that case. Video is kind of a weird exception here, where we don't seem to know how much it emits right now, and like most of the good estimates I've seen seem to imply that video is significantly more costly. But even here, like I think comparisons are pretty helpful. So my best guess right now, and again, this is more of like my personal estimate, and I can justify this later. Um, but video probably emits something like 1% of your daily emissions for every 10 minutes of AI video that you generate. This is about equivalent to driving your car for 1 mile. And again, like this isn't nothing. Like in some ways, it can sound kind of crazy that something you do on your computer could possibly emit as much as your car. But I think even here, like if your friend told you that they had driven 6 miles to film a video of something, like I don't think you would say like that was horrible. You should never do that for the sake of the environment, Like you might say like, oh, that does have a cost. Like maybe making that video is worth it. Maybe it wasn't. But driving 6 miles is also equivalent to generating a full hour of AI video. And the second one gets a lot more scrutiny. Like if you say like, oh, I spent the equivalent of like driving 6 miles on generating an AI video, I think a lot of people that will probably be like, that's so evil what you just did. Like that's a disaster. You're so wasteful. But if you told them I drove 6 miles to film a video, then they would be like, oh, that's a normal thing. Like I don't see any problem with that. And there's this kind of weird double standard here. Like it's getting to the point where like I'm pretty sure that if I posted an AI video that I had generated of like, say like me driving across the country, like some AI version of that, I think some people might be like, that's so wasteful that you did that. But if I literally like drove across the country filming myself, I think people would be like, oh, that's so cool. That's such a neat video. And like driving across the country is kind of an environmental disaster. So like, and that just adds up way more than the AI. And so like, it's not that I don't think you should be like completely not wary of what you're doing with AI. Like obviously, if you were just like spamming AI video like literally all day, like that would really start to add up. But I do just want to put this in the context of just like other similar things that we do in our day-to-day lives, and even like the most intense AI stuff like video and stuff like that, I think really only contributes as much as other like normal things that we do. Like the average 5 minutes of an AI video might be something equivalent to like 20 minutes of playing a PS5 or something like that. And again, I can't remember the last time a friend confessed to me that they were feeling a lot of climate guilt about like playing video games and stuff like that.
I love that you do those comparisons because I'm definitely going to make a LinkedIn post about those quotes.
Yeah, the highest honor. Thank you.
Yeah, so no, I think it's a good comparison because I think sometimes people say like, oh my gosh, you're killing the environment by doing this, but it's like in comparison to what, right? Like, what does that look like? And then my other question is because water usage is a really talked about topic with AI data centers. What is actually true versus what is overstated, and where should we actually be paying attention?
Yeah. So I think the single biggest incorrect statistic in the entire AI environment conversation is the idea that a single AI prompt uses a whole bottle of water. If you trace this to where it came from, there's this 2024 Washington Post article that says writing an email with a chatbot uses a whole bottle of water. And if you look into the assumptions that they were making there, they're assuming that for 100-word email, you're sending something like 10 to 20 AI prompts to write it. And like, I'm an AI power user, but I don't really use like 20 prompts to write 100 words. Like that seems like a little bit much. And they're also assuming that all the AI hardware didn't get more efficient after something like 5 years. And AI hardware is actually getting like really radically more efficient and both energy and water efficient very fast. And so most of our best guesses for how much an AI prompt uses currently is more like 1 to 2 milliliters, which is something like 1/500th of a bottle of water. And if you think about it, like what's ultimately happening when AI uses water is two things. One is water is being used to like cool these like hot computers that have heated up a little bit from answering your prompt. It's like the same way that your computer heats up and has like a fan in it. Like what's happening in the data center is they're flowing water in the general vicinity of hot computers and it's getting a little bit hotter. And over time, some of that evaporates. And I think when Americans are comparing this to like other ways that we personally use water, I think that most people are just not aware of just how many different things in our life actually uses huge amounts of water. Like from what I can tell, only like maybe 10% of our actual water footprint happens in our homes. A lot of our water footprint comes from like the food that we eat. A lot of it comes from the materials that we buy, and the electricity that we generate. Something like 4/5 of all the water that AI quote unquote uses is actually used to generate its electricity in like normal power plants. And every other way that we use electricity also has a water cost. Like, for example, if you have a normal digital clock on your bedside, um, that digital clock probably has like generating the electricity just for that digital clock consumes about a gallon of water every month. Um, and most people don't know this. Like they don't know that like the ways that we generate electricity is mostly by heating water to spin turbines that like spin magnets around wires specifically. And so they hear that there's this like weird ephemeral thing called AI that's flashing on their screen using this really precious resource called water. And they're like, oh man, like we can't waste water on this stupid ephemeral thing. But like literally every time you use a computer or any digital product at all, like water is being used just to generate the electricity. It's being used for a lot of other stuff. Um, and if you start to make water comparisons to like physical objects that we own, then it gets really ridiculous because like in AI's case, like water is like moving in the vicinity of hot computers to cool them down a little bit. And meanwhile, if you buy, say, like a pair of jeans, if you think about it, like a huge amount of water had to be dumped into the ground to make like the cotton for those jeans. And like over time, it eventually grows a plant that is eventually manufactured into a pair of jeans. And so if you do the comparison, like a single pair of jeans probably has the water cost of something like 1.5 million AI prompts. So like if you want to save enough water so that you personally have 1 million AI prompts to not feel guilty about, you can buy like one fewer pair of pants, basically. So like and again, like if anyone's skeptical of what I'm saying, like I would really strongly encourage you to just like look into like all the different things in your life that actually that have very high water costs. Like because just almost everything that we do uses a lot of water because like water is quite plentiful and like obviously there are places that struggle with it, but it's just so useful in so many different processes that like car factories or pharmaceutical plants or other things also use huge amounts of water. And so like AI prompts, I think you would probably have to send on the order of like 2,000 prompts a day, just to raise your water footprint by 1%. It's actually a much more dramatic difference than the energy.
That was really amazing. I have two more questions, and then I'm going to open up for Q&A because I think people here have better questions than I do. So bigger picture, which companies or data center operators are being transparent about their environmental impact and which ones aren't? And I don't know if you know this answer, so just tell me if this is like too vague, but what should we be asking as consumers of those tools?
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot to say about this. Um, I do want to be clear that like I think it's totally fine if people want to boycott specific AI models because they believe that the AI companies are being unethical in some other way, including like being environmentally unethical. But I also want to be clear with them that their personal boycott is not having any like meaningful environmental impact. So like my personal least favorite AI company by far, and like we can disagree about this, is Grok and like XAI specifically. So I read a lot about the impacts of data centers, and there are a lot of places where I'm quite skeptical that data centers have been harmful to people. But XAI's Colossus in Memphis is just like a clear, like wild example of where it just does seem to have been pretty harmful for like five different reasons. There's this giant new building that's using as much energy as like a small city that is drawing almost all of it from these like unpermitted turbines that they snuck in through this like weird stupid loophole that they made the city sign all these NDAs about. And it just seems pretty likely that like Grok significantly polluted the air around them. And if I look at that, even there, like using Grok as like an AI tool itself, like if you use it, you're actually not individually adding like any more pollution to anyone's life than you would like driving your car a few feet. Like there are a lot of cars around me and they all add a certain amount of pollution. And like I'm doing about as much like local damage to my local community by driving my car, like way more actually than if I'm using Grok. But I don't use Grok really because like I don't approve of the way that the company has handled that in total. But it's exclusively because I want to boycott it to kind of send a general message than that like my personal environmental impacts are doing any good. I think in general with data centers, a lot of people don't understand just how many people are interacting with data centers at any one time. Like it's usually on the order of hundreds of thousands. And it's almost like if you were in a stadium and you were like, oh, this stadium is too loud. Like I personally should stand up and leave. And if you wanted to do that to send a message, that makes sense. But if you wanted to do that because you thought that that would actually have a meaningful impact on the noise, like that second one is just incorrect, basically. So like I think when looking into this, you kind of have to make your own mind up about which AI companies are behaving ethically and which aren't. But also understand that like your boycott is just about sending a message and it's not really going to add a meaningful amount of environmental impact either way.
Okay, I'm gonna open it up for questions now. We have a couple minutes, so let's do it like lightning speed. Yeah.
Just a quick one. I just want to do a +1 to Grok, not just because of what it is and what it represents, but the fact that he stole the word because I'm a massive sci-fi nerd and Robert Heinlein's
Right?
Strange Land. I used to use that and would talk with clients I was consulting with and talk about grokking something, and now I can't use that word anymore. So yeah.
Without getting too political, I've had this experience a lot with Elon, where something I used to like now has really bad vibes. I used to love like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when I was a teenager. Like that's great, and like I don't know that I think that's Elon's favorite book still, and like I kind of don't bring it up anymore. So yeah, a lot to say about that, and yeah, Grok as a term. Yeah, it comes from the Heinlein novel. Like it is just such a useful and kind of fun word to say. So I'm a little bit depressed that the vibes have become so negative on it.
Yes.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to ask it promptly. I want to get your thoughts on like AI, those data centers in particular, like emissions in relation to, let's say, a concept of economies of scale. Let's say someone generates a video for 60 minutes in one session versus spreading it out 5 minutes at a time, 12 days in a row. Does the emission, like on paper, the emission counts would be the same because it's still generating 60 minutes of content?
Yeah.
Are there other factors that impact the actual emission count that is generated from those two approaches?
I have to admit, I don't have a solid answer to this question. I think that, like, ultimately the data center is just fielding so many requests from so many different people at once that I'm not entirely sure that, like, whether you personally are bunching your, like, prompts together. Like, ultimately the data center is kind of optimized to bunch as much prompts, like, into really optimized chips in the right way at the same time. So I would personally be a little bit surprised if that had an effect, but I might be wrong. I honestly haven't looked into that as much. It's a general theme that like ultimately like a huge amount of any data center's operating budget comes from buying electricity, and AI companies just really, really, really don't want to use more power than they absolutely need to. And so like obviously their tools still use energy, but they do want to try to find all these different ways of optimizing it by bunching a bunch of prompts together in the same chips. And so I'm personally a little bit skeptical that that would have much impact, but I genuinely don't know.
Toshi and Winston.
How has the environmentalism community reacted to hearing things alternate to their prior beliefs?
That's a good question.
I think that there are like multiple different environmentalist communities actually, and they're coming apart in ways that they didn't used to when I was younger. I've had a lot of like really great feedback from say like environmental scientists who like focus on very general like environmental problems. I think there's also like a general scene of like people who consume a lot of very kind of like surface level material on the environment and mainly think about the environment in terms of like, okay, the environment has like good guys and bad guys, and we need to completely destroy the bad guys. And like, as long as we do that, everything is going to be fine. And I think the actual story of the environment is unfortunately that like most of the ways we emit are actually incredibly useful to us. Like, the worst thing I do for the environment personally is I still drive my car a significant amount, and like that's incredibly useful to me, and like we can talk about how the car companies are bad and the gas companies are bad, but also I'm still choosing to use them, like partly because they're so useful. And I think a lot of like younger people who start to look into environmentalist stuff will kind of think about like, oh, I'm trying to find these individual bad guys that I can remove from my life and everything will be okay. And oh, AI is this massive bad guy. And I think they don't notice just like how many other things in their life emit way more and how like just identifying the specific bad guys without really considering the numbers um like kind of throws you off and kind of incapacitates you from having any serious impact on the climate. Like there was this example, like I've been vegan for 10 years, like partly for climate reasons. Like conveniently, it means I have a way lower water impact than most people, so that's great. But I remember, like a friend was in a pizza restaurant last month actually, and he had overheard these two teenagers talking, and they both clearly identified as environmentalists. And like one of them had said to the other, like, "Oh, our mutual friend uses ChatGPT, so it's crazy that she still calls herself an environmentalist." And then the very next thing she did was she went over and ordered like a meat lover's pizza. Like, as someone who's been pretty fired up about animal agriculture for a while, I'm like, I think this person is missing this much larger bad guy because it's been very normalized, whereas like AI is very new. And so I'll sometimes get a lot of people being like, oh, Andy's trying to like deceive me and like make me think that this obvious bad guy is actually fine and chill. But I find that most of those people don't actually have like a strong background in like the environmentalist community themselves. They're more like people who kind of passively like intake a lot of very surface level environmentalist content and are like, oh, I'm a good person by cutting these specific bad guys from my life.
So essentially, it's really bad if I eat meat and I use AI.
Well, I don't know. I mean, like, I feel like it's kind of like saying, like, oh, if I want to save money, it's really bad if I eat a 7-course meal and buy a gumball every now and then. Like, it's true, technically, but like, the orders of magnitude are just really crazy. Like, something like half of all the agriculture that we grow is grown to feed animals. And all of that involves a huge amount of water. So, like, I don't know, by like not eating a burger, like every single burger that I skip gets me about 10,000 AI prompts, worth like I'm sitting pretty easy on my end, like I'm like, oh, like
I love that model.
every time I have lunch and eat tofu, I'm like, oh, there's 10,000 more prompts for me. That's great.
I love that. And then Winston, go ahead.
So my question is about not individual use, but scale, like the data centers that you're talking about. Because your Memphis example, the same thing happened in Georgia as well. You're picking like rural, disenfranchised areas, and you're basically siphoning off like the electricity, you have runoff, and so that type of pollution, and also like the noise pollution from that size. So what do you think about that type of impact instead? If this is happening not only with like Grok, it's happening with other AI companies as well.
Yeah, I do think that Grok is a really massive outlier here. I have to admit I don't know too much about the Georgia example specifically, and I know you all are down there, so I don't want to like speak too confidently about it. Like going down like a case by case basis. Yeah, there's a ton to say. I just want to make sure I'm answering this question well. Yeah, so the weird thing about a data center, and the main thing that throws this debate off and makes it really difficult, honestly, is that like data centers are really paradoxical buildings where inside they're incredibly optimized for both energy and water use, where like every individual prompt and every individual like use of water just uses shockingly little energy compared to how much they would on your computer. Like data centers are basically the most optimized way that we can do large scale computing, and it's why they're used to host the internet and stuff. But a result of that is also that like they concentrate so much of these individually very optimized things in one physical place that on net this place can still use more energy than like a small city even, and so it can still strain the grid even though each individual thing that happens in it is very small. And like this is a big source of confusion in the debate because people will see these massive like monstrosities popping up in their neighborhood and think, oh, like that thing is using so much energy, that must mean that whatever's happening inside of it is very energy intense and inefficient. And what they're missing is that the reason it's using so much energy is that it's compiling so many individually very small, tiny processes in one physical place. And so the first thing I usually want to say to people is that like if you're worried about data center impacts, like not using AI personally is kind of like leaving the stadium solo, like to like reduce the noise. It's just such a small impact that it's basically never going to make a dent. And like all this basically has to come down to local regulation instead. we have to take individual impacts of data centers on kind of a case by case basis because they don't really relate super hard. I'm quite skeptical that like data centers in most places have significantly impacted water access. I don't know everywhere, but just like most of the stories I've read seem to kind of fizzle when I actually poke at them a little bit. I think the Meta data center in Georgia is actually like the one example I can find of a pretty significant data center actually like requiring a town to build enough infrastructure that water bills are raised for local residents. So like that's kind of an exception. Um, Air pollution, like Grok, from what I can tell, wasn't using like pretty standard pollution controls on their gas turbines, whereas a lot of other data centers do, and they're also just built farther away from residential areas. So air pollution is like the big baddie where I suspect it's probably like the main bad thing about data centers in other places, but I haven't done enough of a deep dive to have too many confident takes other than like the American energy grid in general does generate a lot of air pollution. So we should be pretty cautious if a new source drops in. And then noise pollution also seems to be real as well, failure of regulation. Um, I think that the solution to this is basically that like these things do need to be regulated very carefully, and there are clear places where they haven't been, like Memphis, where like XAI swoops in and is like, hey, we have all this lucrative taxable money for you, and you just need to sign all these NDAs and make sure the community is completely kept out of it before we do that. Um, I do worry in the other direction that like there are a ton of places where data centers have just provided a huge amount of tax revenue to a local tax base that really needs it and haven't, to my knowledge, significantly increased electricity bills or water bills or like polluted the air at all. And like in that case, I do worry that if a data center is completely blocked, it's basically blocking a community from like potentially billions of dollars in tax revenue that they could really use. And so like I do worry that there are places where data centers have really harmed people, but also there are potentially some places where not building the data center have harmed people for the same reason that like not building out other industry that come with certain trade-offs could potentially harm a community because it could be beneficial to like have this very lucrative thing running in their hometown. So it's really complicated. I don't have a strong take on this other than like individuals should really do their own research here, and like the main levers that need to be pulled are at the local level, not at the personal like I shouldn't use this data center for my AI, because like that doesn't really make a dent on like people's experience.
And then my last question to wrap up, if you could leave a room full of AI filmmakers and creatives with one thing to think about or do differently after tonight, what would it be? And this kind of ties in with my first question about how you handle those conversations when you are approached by like, you suck for using AI.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing is like I kind of have to get down on my knees and beg you, like, please do not feel too guilty about using AI. This basically just seems to round out to like emit as much as all the other things we do and have the same environmental impacts as most of the other things that we do. It's just shockingly small and doesn't seem to meaningfully impact your personal emissions at all. Like sometimes I'll just hear people say like, oh, how can I use AI better? Like maybe I should switch from ChatGPT to Google. And like if there were a Google competitor that came out like called Schmoogle or something that was like 10 times as energy efficient as Google, like I personally wouldn't feel too much like personal like need to use it, even though it would save some energy because Google already uses so little energy that it just doesn't make me worry too much. And I kind of feel the same about switching from ChatGPT to Google. Like both of those just feel like the same basic like, oh, it's still just not adding any meaningful amount to my total emissions. The big thing is that like if you're concerned about climate, the two big things that like people really need to focus on is like changes to the grid around them. Like the green energy transition is just like the main thing that people need to focus on. And there are a lot of opportunities around you that AI could potentially help you locate. Like if you just sit down with a really good AI model and be like, I live in this community, please give me a comprehensive plan of how I can have the biggest impact on climate by participating in the local political process and maybe like making sure that a solar plant is allowed to open, or like I'm from Massachusetts personally, and I'm going a little bit crazy right now because there are all these solar plants and battery farms that are getting blocked by locals who don't want them. And I'm like, oh, I really thought Massachusetts was more with it than that. And I think that like more people just using these tools to potentially find ways that they can have outsized impacts on the grid. Like if you keep a solar plant open, even if you divide by the number of people who helped you, like that still can completely swamp your entire life's worth of emissions. Like I think a lot of people don't know just how much of our impact can really just come from the grid and dwarf everything else. So that's usually like my first thing for anybody who seriously wants to focus on climate. And then for your like day-to-day life, just like finding things you can do that make like significant changes. Like the big ones are like driving less, living in cities, reducing your meat consumption. Like these are the things that actually have an impact on our personal emissions. And like if I hear someone say they're not using ChatGPT for the environment, it kind of sounds to me like, oh, I'm like cutting down my like PS5 use for like the environment. Like that just sounds suspicious to me as something that's going to have a big impact.
That was awesome. Can you give Andy a round of applause?